I pressed the lobby button, but the floor indicator instantly blanked out to a dead screen. I was on my 14th delivery of the night. The insulated thermal backpack hung heavily from my shoulders, the thick nylon straps digging into my collarbone through the cheap synthetic fabric of my jacket. Inside the bag rested a cardboard box containing a lukewarm pizza and a sweating plastic container of garlic knots. I stood in the corridor of the 12th floor of a concrete residential tower located on the edge of the city. The carpet beneath my work boots was mottled, sickly brown, worn flat in the center of the hallway by years of foot traffic. The walls were painted in a high-gloss institutional beige that reflected the harsh, flickering illumination of the overhead fluorescent tubes. The air in the corridor was stagnant. It smelled of boiled cabbage, ancient dust, and the faint chemical trace of aerosol air freshener trying to mask the scent of stale tobacco smoke. I adjusted the weight of the bag on my back, feeling the dull ache radiating through my lower spine. My phone screen showed my battery was at 9%. The delivery application displayed a green checkmark, confirming I had dropped off the previous order at apartment 1214. All I wanted was to exit the building, sit in the driver's seat of my car, and turn the ignition. I walked to the end of the hallway. The soles of my rubber boots created a steady friction against the carpet. I stopped in front of the elevator bank. The metal doors were heavily scratched, scarred by the sharp edges of moving boxes and keys. The plastic call button was yellowed and cracked down the center. I pushed it with my index finger. The plastic yielded with a stiff resistance. Deep within the concrete shaft behind the wall, a heavy mechanical grinding commenced. I listened to the tension of steel cables unspooling, a slow, industrial vibration that translated through the floorboards into the soles of my feet. I waited for 2 full minutes. I shifted my weight from my left leg to my right, staring at the scuff marks on the baseboards. Finally, a dull mechanical chime sounded from the speaker above the frame. The metal doors slid apart, retracting with a harsh, metallic grating noise. I stepped into the cabin. The interior was a claustrophobic square, no more than 5 feet across. The floor was covered in gray linoleum tiles that were peeling at the corners, revealing dark, dried adhesive underneath. The walls were paneled in cheap imitation wood veneer, complete with fake grain patterns that repeated every 12 inches. A steel handrail ran along the back wall, bolted unevenly to the paneling. The air inside the cabin was cold and carried the distinct, sharp odor of industrial ammonia floor cleaner mixed with the smell of a wet dog. I turned around to face the doors. I reached out to the control panel. It was a brushed aluminum plate covered in circular plastic buttons, each labeled with a floor number in faded black ink. Above the buttons was a small digital display composed of red light-emitting diodes, currently showing the number 12. I pressed the button marked with a star for the ground floor. The light behind the plastic circle illuminated for a fraction of a second, casting a faint amber glow on my thumb. Then, the entire digital display above the door died. The red numbers vanished, leaving a blank, dark rectangle of glass. I stood there as the metal doors slid shut, sealing me inside the small box. The cabin jolted slightly, and the sensation of gravity shifting in my stomach confirmed the elevator had begun its descent. I looked at the blank digital screen. I felt a mild wave of annoyance wash over me, driven entirely by physical fatigue. I rationalized the malfunction immediately. This was a neglected residential high-rise. The maintenance company clearly cut corners. Electrical faults were inevitable in a building where the carpet was rotting and the call buttons were cracked. The logic was sound and comforting. The display was simply broken. The elevator itself was still moving downward at a steady, consistent pace. I leaned back against the imitation wood paneling. I rested my palm on the steel handrail to support my weight. I closed my eyes for a moment, calculating that it would take roughly 30 seconds to drop 12 floors to the lobby. After a minute had passed, I opened my eyes. The mechanical vibration of the descent was still humming steadily through the floor. I looked at my phone. The screen displayed no cellular service bars. I looked back at the blank indicator panel. We had been moving down for too long. A 12-story drop should not take over 60 seconds. I pushed myself slightly off the back wall. As I did, I noticed a change in the environment. The sharp, chemical smell of the ammonia floor cleaner was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a dense, heavy odor. It smelled like stagnant water, rotting vegetation, and wet earth. The air itself felt different in my lungs. It was thick and saturated with moisture. The temperature in the small cabin had dropped significantly. I could feel a distinct chill seeping through my jacket, settling on the skin of my arms and neck. When I exhaled, a faint mist of condensation plumed in the harsh overhead light. I shifted my stance, my unease growing. I gripped the handrail tighter to steady myself. The tactile feedback from my hand was entirely wrong. The steel bar was no longer cold or smooth. It was warm to the touch, radiating a heat that felt uncomfortably close to human body temperature. The surface yielded slightly beneath the pressure of my fingers, like a layer of dense foam. A thick, sticky resin coated the rail. I immediately pulled my hand away. The friction of the separation was palpable. I looked at my palm. My skin felt coated in a heavy, tacky substance, similar to tree sap mixed with cooking oil. I rubbed my thumb and index finger together, feeling the unnatural viscosity. I wiped my hand vigorously on the denim of my jeans, leaving a dark, wet stain on the fabric. I stared at the handrail. Under the bright overhead light, it looked exactly like a normal, solid steel bar. There was no visual evidence of the resin. I extended a single finger and pressed it against the metal again. It was hot, soft, and wet. I retreated to the center of the cabin, distancing myself from the walls. I told myself it was condensation mixing with years of accumulated grease and dirt. The friction of the elevator descending was causing mechanical heat, warming the metal frame. I blamed my extreme sleep deprivation for exaggerating the sensory details. I looked up at the security mirror mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling. It was a convex plastic lens, heavily scratched and covered in a fine layer of dust. I saw my distorted reflection staring back at me. I saw my bulky jacket, the thick straps of the thermal bag, the tired lines around my mouth. I took a deep, shaky breath. The elevator continued its smooth, unending descent. It had been nearly 4 minutes. I shifted the heavy thermal bag on my shoulders, hooking my thumbs under the nylon straps to alleviate the pressure. I looked back up at the convex mirror. My blood ran cold, pooling heavily in my extremities. The reflection in the dirty plastic lens was standing perfectly straight. Its arms were resting loosely at its sides. Its weight was evenly distributed on both legs. It had not moved its thumbs to adjust the straps. It was perfectly still, watching me from the glass. I froze completely. My respiratory rate dropped to shallow, silent intakes of air. I initiated a total avoidance response. I did not move a single muscle. I lowered my gaze, locking my eyes onto a specific curled edge of the gray linoleum floor. I forced my mind to apply technical logic. I told myself it was an optical illusion caused by the warped plastic of the cheap convex mirror and the angle of the fluorescent lighting. I refused to look up at the corner of the ceiling. I simply stared at the floor, listening to the unending rhythmic vibration of the elevator, dropping deeper and deeper into the earth. After an indeterminate amount of time, the downward motion began to slow. The unnatural feeling of free fall in my stomach eased. The cabin glided to a smooth, silent halt. The mechanical chime did not sound. The metal doors slowly slid open. I raised my head, expecting to see the cracked tile of the lobby or the painted concrete pillars of the underground packing garage. Instead, there was an absolute suffocating void. The space beyond the doors was entirely pitch black. It was a darkness so dense it seemed to absorb the light spilling from the cabin, preventing it from illuminating even a single inch of the floor outside. I stood paralyzed in the center of the elevator. In my peripheral vision, I registered movement in the upper corner. I heard the distinct rustle of synthetic fabric. The reflection stepped forward, unhooked from my movements. It walked smoothly across the boundary of the mirror, passed through the open elevator doors, and vanished entirely into the lightless void. The metal doors slid shut with a heavy finality, and the elevator immediately resumed its descent. I was completely surrounded by darkness. I could not see the metal walls of the duct, but I could feel them. The steel beneath me was hard and unforgiving. The air inside the shaft was completely stagnant. It smelled heavily of oxidized metal, old fiberglass insulation, and decades of accumulated dust. Every time I inhaled, I could feel microscopic particles coating the back of my throat. I needed to finish removing the blockage I had found behind the grate, but I could not do it without light. I decided I had to crawl backward all the way to the access panel in the maintenance room. It was going to be a slow and uncomfortable process. I shifted my weight to begin the backward crawl. As I moved, I noticed a sudden and dramatic drop in the ambient temperature. The air around me went from mildly cool to freezing cold within a matter of seconds. I could feel the chill seeping through the thick fabric of my work shirt. The sudden cold made the hairs on my arms stand up. I stopped moving and tried to think of a logical explanation. I knew the mechanical layout of the building very well. I reasoned that a faulty damper in the main air handler must have suddenly swung open, releasing a draft of trapped, refrigerated air from a pressurized zone. Or perhaps a pressurized line in the old chiller system had finally given way, venting expanding gas into the ductwork. Rapid expansion of gas always causes a severe drop in temperature. It was basic thermodynamics. I nodded in the dark, satisfied with my technical conclusion. I placed my palms flat against the bottom of the duct and pushed myself backward. The rubber toes of my boots scraped against the metal floor. The noise was loud and hollow in the confined space. I moved back about 5 feet. I paused to catch my breath. The air was getting even colder. It felt like walking into a commercial freezer. I reached out with my left hand to brace myself against the side wall of the duct. My heavy work glove made contact with the cold steel much sooner than I expected. My arm was barely extended. I frowned in the dark. I reached out with my right hand. I touched the opposite wall with my right elbow still bent. I stayed perfectly still. I tried to visualize the dimensions of the trunk line. When I entered the duct, it was 30 inches wide. I had plenty of room to shift my shoulders side to side. Now, the left and right walls felt like they were only 20 inches apart. I tried to rationalize this physical discrepancy. I told myself that I must have crawled into a different branch of the system without realizing it. Many commercial layouts use tapered ducts to maintain static air pressure as the lines get further from the blower motor. I assumed I had just blindly navigated into a narrowing reduction section. I chastised myself for losing my spatial awareness in the dark. I just needed to keep moving backward to find the wider section again. I pushed myself backward another 2 feet. My left shoulder scraped hard against the metal wall. A second later, my right shoulder made contact with the opposite side. The physical pressure was undeniable. The duct was actively getting smaller. I stopped moving completely. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I was wedged tight between the 2 steel walls. I could feel the cold metal pressing through my shirt on both sides. I tried to twist my torso, but there was no room to rotate. The ceiling of the duct was now grazing the top of my head. I tried to rely on logic again. I told myself it was an illusion caused by the absolute darkness and the onset of claustrophobia. The human brain relies heavily on visual input to understand spatial relationships. Without light, my tactile senses were becoming hypersensitive, making the space feel more restrictive than it actually was. I was just having a panic attack. I closed my eyes, even though it made no difference, and focused on controlling my heart rate. I told myself the metal was stationary. I took a deep breath. As my chest expanded, my ribs pressed firmly against the left and right walls of the shaft. The metal did not give way. It felt rigid and immensely heavy. I realized I could not move backward anymore. My hips were caught between the sides. The freezing air burned my lungs. I reached my hands forward, feeling blindly in the dark space ahead of me. The metal floor felt strange. It was perfectly smooth, lacking the usual ridges and joints of standard sheet metal. I dragged my body forward, pulling with my forearms. The walls scraped against my ribs, tearing the fabric of my shirt. I moved 1 inch at a time, fighting the immense physical pressure. I felt a sudden drop-off directly in front of my hands. I reached down. It was an open vent hole. I did not care where it led. I forced my head and shoulders through the opening. The metal side squeezed my waist painfully as I wriggled free. I fell forward and landed hard on a solid concrete floor. I was no longer above the sporting goods store. The air here was damp and smelled like wet earth. I lay on the ground in the dark, gasping for air. Above me, I heard a massive, structural sound. It was the sound of thick metal buckling and folding under extreme pressure. I listened closely as the duct I had just escaped violently flattened itself entirely, leaving no trace of what had caused the impossible compression. My plastic clipboard slipped from my fingers, fell 3 feet, and landed perfectly upright, balancing on its narrow bottom edge against the polished linoleum floor. I stared at it in the dim lighting. I was an inventory clerk, assigned to a massive, bankrupt department store that anchored the eastern end of the mall. It was my 3rd consecutive overnight shift. My job was to physically count every remaining piece of merchandise in the women's apparel section before the liquidators arrived in the morning. The clipboard held a thick stack of printed spreadsheets. It should have fallen flat. It was top-heavy. Instead, it stood perfectly perpendicular to the floor, defying its own weight. I stood still for a full minute, watching it. I waited for a draft from the ventilation system to knock it over. It did not move. I slowly crouched down and wrapped my fingers around the smooth wooden board. As soon as I applied pressure, the object felt completely normal. I picked it up and blamed the event on a rare physical anomaly. Sometimes objects find a perfect, impossible center of gravity. It was just a statistical outlier. I also knew I was severely sleep-deprived. My eyes were dry, and my lower back ached from standing on the hard floor for 6 hours. My brain was likely exaggerating the strangeness of the situation. I turned my attention back to the clothing rack in front of me. I held a digital inventory scanner in my right hand. The device was bulky, encased in thick yellow rubber to prevent damage from drops. I squeezed the trigger. A thin, horizontal red laser projected onto a cardboard tag attached to a gray polyester sweater. The scanner registered the barcode and emitted a short, high-pitched electronic confirmation tone. I moved to the next hanger. I repeated the process. The repetitive motion was mind-numbing. Pull the tag, aim the scanner, squeeze the trigger, wait for the electronic tone, release the tag. The department store was vast and completely silent, aside from the faint, continuous electrical vibration coming from the overhead emergency lighting fixtures. The main retail lights were shut off to save power. The emergency lights cast a weak, sickly yellow glow over the aisles. The shadows were deep and dense. The air smelled like stale dust, cheap synthetic fabrics, and old carpet adhesive. I worked my way down the aisle, counting dozens of identical sweaters. At the end of the aisle stood a small grouping of display mannequins. They were arranged on a raised circular platform covered in faded gray carpet. There were 4 of them. They were constructed from molded fiberglass and painted in a flat, pale beige color. They had no facial features. Their heads were completely smooth, with only slight indentations where the eyes and nose should be. Their arms were posed in unnatural, stiff angles to display winter coats. I hated walking near them in the dark. The weak emergency lighting cast long, distorted shadows behind their legs. I focused on my scanner. I scanned the black coat on a hanger. The device emitted its tone. I looked down at the digital screen to verify the count. When I looked back up, my line of sight rested on the mannequins at the end of the aisle. The shadows cast by the fiberglass figures did not match the angle of the overhead light. The light fixture was directly above them, which should have cast a shadow straight down onto the circular platform. Instead, their shadows stretched horizontally across the linoleum floor, pointing directly at my boots. I stopped scanning. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples with my free hand. I told myself it was a simple optical illusion. My eyes were fatigued from staring at the bright red laser and the small digital screen. The yellow emergency lighting was insufficient, and the human brain naturally tries to find patterns in the dark. The shadows were just a trick of the weak illumination bouncing off the polished linoleum. I opened my eyes. The shadows were still pointing at me. I took a deep breath and looked up at the light fixture. The plastic cover was old and yellowed. As I watched, the electrical vibration noise from the fixture suddenly pitched downward, and the light faltered. It was a brief power fluctuation. The store went completely black for a fraction of a second before the weak yellow light returned. When the light stabilized, I looked back at the platform. The mannequin standing closest to the edge of the platform was no longer facing the main walkway. Its smooth, featureless head was now angled sharply to the right, looking directly down the aisle at me. Its torso had shifted. I dropped my hand to my side. The heavy scanner bumped against my thigh. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I stood frozen in the aisle. I aggressively rationalized the visual change. I told myself I simply had not paid close enough attention to their original poses. I had been staring at barcodes for hours. My short-term memory was compromised by exhaustion. The mannequin had always been facing this direction. I was projecting my own anxiety onto a stationary piece of plastic. I gripped the scanner tightly. I needed to finish this aisle and move to the shoe department. I took a step forward to scan the next item. The overhead light faltered again. The electrical vibration stopped. The darkness fell for half a second, and the light returned. The mannequin was no longer on the raised platform. It was standing on the linoleum floor, exactly 3 feet closer to me. I stopped breathing. The logic in my head desperately tried to assemble a reason for this. I thought about microsleeps. Severe fatigue can cause the brain to shut down for several seconds without the person realizing it. I told myself I must have fallen asleep while standing, dropped into a dream state, and my perception of time had skipped forward. But I knew I had not moved. My boots were in the exact same position on the floor tiles. The fiberglass figure was undeniably closer. Its beige, featureless face was pointed directly at my chest. I realized a distinct pattern. The movement only occurred when the illumination failed. When the light was stable, the object was bound by the laws of physics. It was a strict rule. If the light source remained constant, I was safe. I slowly looked up at the ceiling. The long rows of fluorescent tubes stretched far into the darkness of the store. The electrical vibration from the fixture above me was growing erratic. I looked down at the wooden clipboard in my left hand. I made a firm decision. I would not look up. If the visual anomaly required me to witness the darkness to progress, I would simply remove my vision from the equation. I stared intensely at the black grid printed on my inventory sheet. I memorized the lines. I focused on the texture of the paper and the small smudge of blue ink near the bottom corner. I heard the overhead light falter again. The brief darkness washed over my peripheral vision. I kept my eyes locked on the paper. I did not look up. I took a slow step backward. My heel hit the polished floor. I waited. The silence was heavy. I took another step backward. I kept my chin tucked into my chest. The light faltered a third time. The electrical vibration died and returned. I stared at the clipboard. The paper began to tremble because my hands were shaking violently. The main electrical breakers for the entire department store failed simultaneously. The weak yellow glow vanished entirely. The low-frequency electrical drone died, leaving behind an absolute, suffocating silence. The darkness was total. I could not see the clipboard in my hands. I could not see the floor beneath my boots. I stood perfectly still in the pitch black. I squeezed my eyes shut, even though it made no difference. The air around me grew incredibly cold. Then, the silence was broken. From the darkness directly in front of me, I heard the distinct, dry friction of heavy fiberglass rubbing against fiberglass. It was the sound of stiff, unyielding joints forcing themselves to move. The friction sound occurred again, this time from my left side. Then it came from my right side. The dry, heavy scraping noises multiplied. They formed a tight circle around my current position. The scraping stopped. I felt a draft of cold, stale air against my face. The unseen figures were waiting in the dark for the backup generator to engage, knowing I would have no choice but to open my eyes. The illuminated plastic exit sign mounted above the heavy metal door flickered twice, and the red letters rearranged themselves from exit to a glowing red wait. I stopped walking and stared at the plastic casing. I was taking a shortcut through a rear service corridor of the mall. I had just finished watching a late movie at the multiplex on the top floor. It was near midnight, and the main retail concourses were gated off for security. The theater staff had directed me toward this concrete service route to reach the parking garage. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes. I looked at the sign again. The letters clearly spelled, "Wait." The red light cast a harsh glare against the painted cinder block wall. I carried 2 plastic shopping bags filled with clothes I had bought earlier in the evening. The thin plastic handles were cutting deeply into the skin of my fingers. I was exhausted. The movie had been nearly 3 hours long, and the theater had been incredibly dark. I rationalized the strange sign as a simple digital malfunction combined with my own visual fatigue. Many modern exit signs use internal LED matrices. It was highly probable that a cluster of diodes had shorted out, creating an optical illusion that my tired brain misread as a specific word. It was a mundane electrical failure. I ignored the red letters, pushed the heavy metal door open with my shoulder, and stepped into the next section of the corridor. The door closed heavily behind me. The locking mechanism engaged with a sharp metallic noise. I found myself in a long, narrow hallway. The floor was poured concrete, sealed with a gray industrial epoxy. The walls were constructed of large cinder blocks painted in a pale institutional green. The ceiling was low, covered in exposed pipes and metal ventilation ducts. The illumination came from a single row of fluorescent light tubes spaced evenly down the center of the ceiling. The light was harsh and white. Many of the plastic light diffusers were filled with the dark shapes of dead insects. The air in the corridor was very cold and smelled strongly of industrial bleach mixed with the scent of old, stagnant mop water. The hallway stretched straight ahead of me. I could see another heavy metal door at the very end, perhaps 200 feet away. I adjusted my grip on the plastic shopping bags and began walking. My shoes made a flat, rhythmic noise against the sealed concrete. The sound was isolated and lonely. The service corridor was entirely devoid of ambient noise. There was no background music, no distant conversations, no hum of traffic. There was only the sound of my own walking. I kept my eyes focused on the metal door at the end of the hall. I walked at a steady, normal pace. I estimated it would take me about 1 minute to reach the end of the corridor. I counted my steps to pass the time. 10 steps. 20 steps. 30 steps. The thin plastic handles of the bags continued to dig into my hands. I shifted the weight to my wrists. After 50 steps, I looked up. The metal door at the end of the hall did not appear to be any closer. It still looked exactly 200 feet away. I stopped walking. I frowned and looked back over my shoulder. The door I had just entered through was about 50 feet behind me. I had definitely covered ground. I looked forward again. The end of the hallway had not changed. The perspective remained exactly the same. I took a deep breath. The smell of bleach burned my nostrils. I tried to apply technical logic to what I was seeing. Forced perspective is a common architectural illusion. The uniform size of the painted cinder blocks, the perfectly straight lines of the exposed pipes, and the equidistant spacing of the fluorescent lights created a visual tunnel effect. This repetition of geometric patterns was destroying my depth perception. My brain could not accurately judge the distance because there were no unique visual markers to anchor my sight. I convinced myself that the hallway just looked longer than it actually was. I tightened my grip on the bags and started walking again, faster this time. I walked continuously for another 5 minutes. My heart rate elevated. A thin layer of sweat formed on my forehead despite the freezing temperature of the air. The physical exertion was real. My calves began to burn. I was walking at a brisk pace. I looked forward. The metal door remained exactly 200 feet away. The size of the door in my field of vision had not increased by a single millimeter. I stopped entirely. I dropped the plastic shopping bags onto the concrete floor. The sudden lack of weight on my fingers felt strange. My chest heaved as I took in shallow breaths. The logical rationalization in my mind began to break down. The mall was a large structure, but it was physically impossible for a single straight corridor to be this long without extending out into the surrounding parking lot. I had been walking fast enough to cover at least 3 city blocks. The architectural geometry of my situation was fundamentally wrong. I decided I had made a mistake. I assumed I had entered an unmapped utility tunnel that ran the entire subterranean length of the property. I just needed to turn around, go back through the door with the faulty exit sign, and ask the theater staff for different directions. I turned around to face the direction I had come from. I expected to see the metal door 50 feet away. Instead, I saw a solid wall of pale green cinder blocks. The door was completely gone. The hallway extended infinitely in the opposite direction, illuminated by a perfectly straight, unending row of harsh white fluorescent lights. The mortar lines between the blocks were seamless. There was no frame, no hinges, and no indication that a door had ever existed there. A cold panic seized my chest. The air in the corridor suddenly felt incredibly heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. I abandoned my shopping bags on the floor. I turned back toward the original direction and began to run. I sprinted down the center of the concrete floor. My shoes struck the ground rapidly. I pumped my arms, keeping my eyes locked on the distant metal door. As I ran, the fluorescent light tube directly above my starting position abruptly lost power. The glass tube went dark. A second later, the next light tube in the sequence failed. I looked back while running. The darkness was advancing down the corridor behind me in a steady, rhythmic sequence. The lights were shutting off one by one, chasing me down the endless tunnel. The dark space consumed my abandoned shopping bags. I ran harder. My lungs burned. The distance to the door finally began to shrink. The tunnel effect was breaking. 100 feet. 50 feet. The darkness was closing in behind me, moving slightly faster than I could sprint. 10 feet. I reached out with both hands and hit the metal crash bar of the exit door. I pushed with all my remaining body weight. The door swung open violently. I threw myself through the threshold, just as the final fluorescent light in the corridor failed, plunging the hallway into absolute blackness. I rolled onto a hard surface and gasped for air. I squeezed my eyes shut, thankful to be out of the corridor. I waited for my breathing to slow down. I opened my eyes to survey the parking garage. I was not in the parking garage. I was lying flat on a pane of thick, transparent glass. I looked down through the glass. 60 feet below me, I saw the familiar off-white and gray ceramic tiles of the mall's central food court atrium. I saw the tops of the stacked chairs and tables. I was lying directly on the exterior surface of the large glass dome that covered the atrium. I slowly turned my head and looked up. Above me was a vast solid floor of off-white and gray ceramic tiles, stretching out in all directions. I was trapped inside a massive, inverted replica of the mall, suspended between a glass ceiling below me and a ceramic floor above me, with no physical way to reach either surface. The hot, soapy water in my yellow mop bucket instantly evaporated into a thick cloud of dry, freezing vapor. I lowered the heavy cotton mop head to the floor and stared at the empty yellow plastic container. There was no water left, only a thin film of white chemical residue coating the bottom of the bucket. I am a night shift janitor. I was standing in the exact center of the mall food court. It was 3 a.m. My shift required me to clean the massive seating area, empty the commercial trash receptacles, and run a heavy mechanical floor buffer over the main walkways. The food court was an enormous, cavernous space. It was designed to hold hundreds of patrons during the day. Now, it was entirely empty and isolated. The floor was covered in small, square ceramic tiles. The tiles were off-white with dark gray diamond patterns located at every intersection. The tables were made of cheap faux wood laminate, bolted directly into the concrete subfloor. The chairs were heavy metal frames with hard blue plastic seats. I left the empty mop bucket near a concrete pillar and walked over to my janitorial card. I needed to finish the floor buffing before my shift ended. I grabbed the heavy buffer machine and pushed it away from the wall. The machine was old and incredibly heavy. It had a solid cast iron base covered by a dark green plastic shroud. The handle was cold steel, wrapped in black rubber grips. I crouched down and unwound the thick orange extension cord. I walked the heavy rubber plug over to an industrial wall outlet. I pushed the metal prongs into the receptacle. I walked back to the machine. I placed my hands on the rubber grips. I squeezed the ignition trigger mechanism. The heavy motor engaged. The thick circular abrasive pad began to spin rapidly against the ceramic tile floor. The machine immediately pulled to the right due to the torque of the motor. I used my hips and my shoulder weight to steer it back into a straight line. I walked in long, slow, overlapping rows. I watched the dull tile become slightly more reflective behind the spinning pad. The air in the vast room smelled of old grease from the dormant fryers in the surrounding restaurant stalls. The metal security grates were pulled down over the service counters. The neon signs for the pizza place and the burger stand were completely dark. The only illumination came from the high overhead emergency lights, which cast a pale, sickly glow across the empty chairs. I worked for 20 straight minutes. The physical labor was monotonous and exhausting. My shoulders began to ache from fighting the pulling motion of the heavy motor. I focused entirely on the small patch of floor directly in front of the machine. The repetitive physical motion helped me stay awake. I stepped backward, pulling the heavy machine with me over the dirty tiles. The atmosphere in the vast room began to change. I noticed it first on my forearms. The fine hairs on my skin stood completely straight. A dense, prickling sensation spread across my skin, moving up my arms and into my neck. The air grew incredibly dry, parching the back of my throat. The faint smell of old cooking grease was entirely replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. I felt a slight, continuous pressure building deep inside my inner ears. I stopped walking but kept my hands firmly on the rubber grips. The heavy buffer pad continued to spin against the floor. I applied a strict technical logic to the situation. I knew the floor buffer was an outdated, poorly maintained piece of equipment. The internal electrical wiring hidden beneath the green plastic shroud was likely frayed and exposed. I assumed the heavy industrial motor was generating an intense localized electromagnetic field. Furthermore, the rapid spinning friction of the coarse abrasive pad against the synthetic polymer coating of the floor tiles was likely creating a massive, localized charge of static electricity. The incredibly dry, unconditioned air inside the empty mall was preventing the static charge from naturally dissipating into the environment. I told myself it was a common industrial hazard. I just needed to finish this section quickly and then properly ground the machine against the metal pipe. I tightened my grip on the handles. I squeezed the trigger harder and forced the machine forward. As I resumed sweeping the floor, a new, distinct sensation washed over me. It was a heavy physical pressure on the back of my neck. I felt the undeniable weight of being watched. The food court was vast, open, and isolated. I was the only living person inside the sealed building. I reasoned that the extreme static electrical charge in the air was simply overstimulating my nervous system. I told myself the electrical field was tricking my brain into a heightened state of paranoia and causing a false physical response. I refused to stop working. I kept my head angled down. I stared intensely at the spinning green pad. I pushed the machine toward the center of the seating area. The long rows of identical tables and chairs surrounded me on all sides. I kept my vision focused downward on the ceramic tiles. However, my peripheral vision began to register subtle visual anomalies. In the extreme corners of my eyes, the heavy metal chairs did not look empty. Dark, solid silhouettes occupied the seats. The shapes were perfectly still. They did not move, and they did not create any noise. They simply sat at the tables in the dim light. I aggressively rationalized the visual data. I told myself it was a severe optical distortion. My extreme physical fatigue, combined with the weak overhead emergency lighting, was creating dark blind spots in my peripheral vision. I applied a strict avoidance tactic. I decided I would only look at the floor. I would employ an almost look strategy. I would not lift my head. I would not look directly at the tables. I would completely ignore the dark shapes and pretend the room was entirely empty. The static charge in the air grew thicker and more oppressive. The hair on my head began to lift upward. The synthetic fabric of my uniform shirt clung tightly to my chest and stomach. The skin on my hands felt uncomfortably tight and hot. The pressure inside my ears became painful, like descending rapidly in an airplane. I decided the electrical risk was finally too high. The machine was genuinely malfunctioning and creating a dangerous environment. I released my grip on the ignition trigger. The heavy motor spun down. The circular pads stopped moving. The room became perfectly silent. I slowly let go of the metal handles. The instant my skin separated from the rubber grips, a bright blue arc of electricity jumped from my fingertips directly to the metal shaft of the machine. The shock was intense. It sent a painful, burning spasm up my right arm. I stumbled backward away from the buffer. The static charge in the surrounding air did not vanish. It intensified. The cold, dry vapor from the evaporated mop bucket still hung low near the floor tiles. I looked down at the ground. I waited for the electrical charge to dissipate. I listened to the absolute silence of the enormous room. Then, all at once, the silence ended. From every direction around me, the heavy metal chairs moved. It was the distinct, grinding friction of hundreds of metal legs dragging violently backward against the ceramic tiles at the exact same moment. The unseen crowd had stood up to surround me. The pressure gauge on the red fire extinguisher read 0, and a thick black sludge began to drip slowly from its rubber hose onto the concrete floor. I wiped a drop of the dark liquid off the thumb of my leatherwork glove. I am a municipal fire inspector. It was my job to verify that commercial properties met the minimum safety standards required by the city. I was standing in the basement sprinkler control room of the mall. The room was located at the very end of a long, narrow service corridor behind the main subterranean boiler room. It was an incredibly small, claustrophobic space. The walls were constructed of rough, unfinished poured concrete. The ceiling was low. Large iron pipes ran along every surface, feeding pressurized water to the overhead sprinkler heads on the retail floors above. In the center of the cramped room sat 2 massive iron water reserve tanks. They were painted an industrial green, but the paint was heavily flaking off, revealing dark brown, textured rust underneath. I held a metal clipboard in my right hand. Attached to it was a detailed multi-page checklist of local code requirements. I held a heavy aluminum flashlight in my left hand. The only illumination in the room came from a single bare light bulb hanging from a frayed wire in the center of the ceiling. The light was weak and cast long, confusing shadows over the complex plumbing. I used my flashlight to illuminate the dark corners behind the massive water tanks. The air in the room was incredibly damp and cold. It smelled heavily of stagnant water, wet concrete, and oxidized iron. The floor was covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust and small, dark puddles of condensation that had dripped from the freezing pipes overhead. I walked over to the first water tank. I checked the main brass shutoff valve. I used my gloved thumb to rub the thick layer of dirt off the paper inspection tag. The last recorded inspection had been performed 7 years ago. I noted the massive safety violation on my clipboard with a blue pen. I moved to the secondary pressure regulator valve. The glass face of the brass dial was covered in a thick layer of grime. I wiped the glass clean. The needle was pointing to a dangerously low number. The entire fire suppression system for the east wing of the mall was completely compromised. I shook my head in disgust. The property management company was going to face severe financial penalties. I wrote another detailed note on my sheet. My partner, a man named David, was currently 2 floors above me. He was inspecting the main kitchen exhaust hoods in the food court. We had agreed to meet by the freight elevator in exactly 30 minutes. I was entirely alone in the deep subterranean level of the building. The damp, heavy air in the cramped room suddenly changed. The familiar smell of stagnant water and rust vanished completely. It was instantly replaced by a harsh, chemical odor. It smelled intensely of burning ozone and melting plastic casing. The scent was incredibly strong and offensive. It stung the sensitive tissue inside my nose and made my eyes water profusely. The ambient air temperature in the room spiked, becoming uncomfortably warm and thick within seconds. I stopped writing. I shined my flashlight around the small room. I scanned the low ceiling, looking for any trace of physical smoke. There was none. I examined the main electrical conduit running along the far concrete wall. The metal pipe looked completely normal and cold to the touch. I tried to apply a logical, mundane reason to the sudden, overwhelming smell. The mall was an aging, neglected structure. The electrical infrastructure was failing across the entire property. I assumed a large industrial breaker box in the adjacent boiler room had finally shorted out under a heavy load. The thick rubber coating on the heavy gauge wires was likely melting, and the toxic smell was simply drifting through the ventilation grates into my small control room. I chuckled quietly to myself. I muttered a sarcastic joke under my breath about how the building was actively trying to burn itself down before I could officially condemn it. I used the dark humor to cope with the miserable, isolating working conditions. It was a normal psychological defense mechanism. I turned back to the massive iron water tank to finish recording the manufacturer's serial numbers. From the narrow, dark hallway directly outside the open door of the control room, a voice called out to me. It was David's voice. The specific tone, the vocal pitch, and the slight regional accent were perfectly identical to my partner's. But the delivery of the words was fundamentally wrong. I am finished with the kitchen hoods and I am coming down to find you. The voice was entirely flat. It lacked any natural inflection, emotion, or conversational rhythm. The volume remained exactly the same from the first syllable to the last. More importantly, there was absolutely no sound of breathing. Human speech requires the lungs to constantly expel and intake air, which creates subtle pauses and wet noises between phrases. This voice had none of those biological markers. It was a continuous, uninterrupted stream of sound, like a compressed digital audio file played back through a cheap, failing speaker. I froze completely. My blue pen hovered an inch over the paper on the clipboard. The logical part of my brain desperately tried and failed to provide a reason for the unnatural speech pattern. The terrible smell of melting plastic grew even stronger, burning my throat. My survival instincts overrode my professional training. I did not call back to him. I did not walk out into the hallway to investigate. I quietly stepped backward. I moved into the narrow, dark space between the rough concrete wall and the massive green water tank. The gap was barely wide enough to accommodate my shoulders. I pressed my back flat against the freezing concrete. I turned off my aluminum flashlight. I stood in the pitch dark, clutching the heavy metal cylinder tightly to my chest. The silence in the room was heavy and absolute. I held my breath. I listened to the hallway. A figure walked through the doorway and entered the control room. The single bare bulb cast a long, distorted shadow across the dusty floor. I watched the edge of the shadow from my hiding place behind the tank. The footsteps did not sound like heavy rubber work boots hitting a concrete floor. The sound was soft, heavy, and wet. It was the distinct sound of massive raw meat slapping heavily against the dirty floor. The physical impact was dense and heavy. The figure stopped moving in the exact center of the room. The smell of ozone became entirely overpowering. The wet, slapping noise began again. The figure slowly walked the perimeter of the small room. It dragged its heavy mass across the concrete. I pressed myself harder against the wall. The rough concrete scraped the skin on the back of my neck. The shadow moved closer to the water tank. The figure stopped moving again. It was standing directly on the other side of the curved iron metal, less than 2 feet away from my face. The identical, replicated voice spoke again. The flat, breathless cadence vibrated through the humid air. I know you are in here. I can smell your teeth. The headlights of the gray sedan illuminated the concrete pillar, revealing a hollow void where the engine block should have been. I looked through the empty space between the front fenders and saw the painted yellow, packing lines directly through the chassis. The vehicle had no motor, no alternator, and no battery. Yet the bright halogen beams cast a harsh glare against the painted concrete. I stood perfectly still on the third step of my yellow fiberglass ladder. The hood of the car was completely missing. The electrical system should not have been able to function without a power source. I stared at the bright lights for a long moment. I blinked hard, rubbed the cold dust from my eyes, and turned my attention back to the ceiling fixture. I was an independent commercial electrician. The property managers of the failing mall had hired me to replace the burnout high-pressure sodium bulbs in the subterranean parking garage. It was a massive, 3-level concrete structure located entirely underground. I was working on the second level. It was a completely mundane, repetitive job. I reached into my thick canvas tool pouch and pulled out a pair of wire snips. I told myself the car must be an abandoned project. Teenagers frequently broke into the lower levels to strip parts from forgotten vehicles. Someone had likely hot-wired a small secondary battery directly to the headlight harness and hidden it inside the cabin as a prank. It was a logical, simple explanation. I ignored the car and focused on the heavy metal light fixture above my head. The garage was vast and completely empty. There were no other cars parked on this level. The ceiling was low, supported by thick, square concrete pillars painted with large yellow numbers indicating the parking zones. The paint was peeling and faded. The air was heavy, damp, and freezing cold. It smelled strongly of old motor oil, wet cement, and the faint, bitter scent of exhaust fumes that had settled into the porous surfaces over decades of use. The ambient light was terrible. High-pressure sodium bulbs take several minutes to warm up, and they cast a harsh, unnatural orange glow that washes out all true colors and flattens depth perception. The shadows cast by the thick concrete pillars were dense and geometric. I used my gloved hands to unlatch the dirty, wire-reinforced glass cover of the heavy light fixture. A thick layer of dead moths and black soot fell onto the shoulders of my heavy canvas work jacket. I brushed the debris away and reached up to unscrew the dead bulb. The glass envelope was cold and covered in a fine layer of gray dust. The internal electrical ballast of the fixture emitted a constant, low-frequency electrical drone. I twisted the large bulb, feeling the dry friction of the metal threads grinding against the ceramic socket. I pulled the dead bulb out and carefully set it into the padded cardboard box attached to the side tray of my ladder. I grabbed a fresh bulb. It felt heavy and fragile in my gloved hand. I guided it into the socket and began to twist it into place. As the new bulb seated into the fixture, a new physical sensation entered the subterranean garage. It started as a subtle vibration in the thick rubber solace of my work boots. It traveled up the solid fiberglass legs of the ladder and into my knees. It was a sub-bass hum. It was a frequency so incredibly low that I felt it in my chest cavity before my eardrums actually registered the sound. The hum was steady and rhythmic. It felt exactly like standing too close to a massive industrial diesel generator. The air pressure in the garage seemed to increase instantly. My ribs vibrated slightly with each sustained pulse of the low frequency. I stopped turning the bulb. I kept my arm raised above my head and listened closely. The sound echoed heavily off the flat concrete floors and the low ceiling, making it impossible to determine the exact origin point. It seemed to come from the very foundation of the concrete structure. I immediately applied my technical knowledge to the situation. The underground garage was located directly beneath the city center. The roads above were major arteries for commercial shipping and public transportation. I assumed a convoy of heavy freight trucks or a city bus was idling at a red light on the street level directly above the mall. The massive diesel engines were producing a resonant frequency that perfectly matched the structural frequency of the concrete pillars holding up the ceiling. The heavy vibration was simply traveling down through the internal steel rebar and amplifying in the empty subterranean space below. It was a standard architectural occurrence. It was known as sympathetic resonance. I nodded slowly to myself, satisfied with the mundane explanation. I finished tightening the bulb. The orange light flickered and began to slowly warm up. I climbed down the ladder. I folded the heavy fiberglass legs together, lifted the ladder by the center rung, and carried it toward the next concrete pillar. The sub-bass hum did not fade as the minutes passed. It grew slightly more intense. The physical vibration in my chest became highly uncomfortable. It felt as if the stagnant air inside my lungs was physically shaking. I placed the ladder under the next dead light fixture. I locked the metal spreaders into place to secure the legs. I opened my tool pouch. As my hand reached inside to grab my wire strippers, the auditory anchor of the environment shifted. The heavy, mechanical hum vibrating through the concrete was suddenly broken by a clear, distinct sound. It was a human voice. It was calling out from the lowest, darkest level of the parking garage, 2 floors below my current position. I froze. My hand hovered just above the canvas pouch. The voice was small, high-pitched, and clearly frightened. It belonged to a young girl. It was my daughter's voice. I heard the specific slight lisp she had when pronouncing certain consonants. She was calling my name, asking for help in a panicked, crying tone. The sound drifted up the wide concrete vehicle ramp that connected the 2nd level to the 3rd level below. The logic in my brain immediately collapsed. My daughter was completely safe at home, asleep in her bed on the other side of the city. She had absolutely no reason to be walking around an abandoned subterranean parking garage at 4 in the morning. It was a physical and geographical impossibility. I told myself it was a severe auditory hallucination. The extreme acoustic properties of the empty concrete garage were distorting the sound of a stray animal, or perhaps the wind moving violently through a broken ventilation shaft. The intense sub-bass frequency shaking the room was disorienting my inner ear, causing my fatigued brain to misinterpret random environmental noise as something deeply personal and familiar. It was a documented psychological phenomenon caused by extreme isolation and sensory deprivation in industrial environments. I told myself this firmly. I squeezed the sides of my fiberglass ladder until my knuckles ached. The voice called out again. It was significantly louder this time. The words echoed clearly up the concrete ramp. The sheer panic in her tone was visceral and raw. The logical rationalization failed entirely. The biological parental instinct to protect completely overrode my technical logic. I dropped my heavy tool belt onto the concrete floor. The metal tools hit the ground hard. I turned away from the ladder. I made the immediate decision to flee the building. I did not run toward the lower level to investigate. I ran directly toward the main exit. I sprinted across the empty parking deck, heading for the steep concrete ramp that led up to the street level. My heavy boots pounded against the solid concrete floor. The sub-bass hum vibrated violently in the cold air all around me. The harsh orange light of the sodium bulbs blurred as I ran past the thick support pillars. I reached the base of the exit ramp. The incline was long and steep. I pushed my legs hard, sprinting upward toward the automated toll gate at the top. The small square toll booth was completely dark and empty. The heavy wooden barricade arm was lowered, blocking the exit lane. I ran toward the small gap between the wooden arm and the outer concrete wall. As I ran up the steep incline, the voice echoing from the lowest level changed. It did not fade away. It shifted. The pitch dropped rapidly. The terrified, high-pitched tone of my daughter dissolved completely. The voice echoing through the concrete structure became my exact voice. It was my own vocal cords, my own cadence, my own pitch. The voice was screaming and agonizing, prolonged physical pain from the pitch-black floor deep below me. I reached the toll gate. I tried to squeeze sideways past the wooden arm. The heavy canvas fabric of my work jacket caught firmly on a jagged metal bracket attached to the booth. I pulled violently, tearing the canvas. The screaming continued from below, filling the massive concrete void with the sound of my own torture. I broke free from the metal bracket. I stood at the exact top of the ramp, inches from the safety of the street level. The municipal streetlights outside cast a pale white glow onto the asphalt. I stopped moving. I heard a new sound approaching rapidly from the absolute bottom of the exit ramp. It was a set of incredibly heavy, fast footsteps rushing up the concrete incline directly behind me. The impacts were completely silent. There was no noise of shoes hitting the ground, but I could feel the immense physical weight of each stride vibrating heavily through the concrete slab beneath my boots. The silent footsteps closed the entire distance of the ramp instantly, stopping directly behind my shoulders. The digital display screen on the back of my camera flickered, and the bright yellow timestamp located in the bottom right corner changed to read a date from 1992. I lowered the heavy digital single-lens reflex camera from my face, and stared at the glowing numbers. I turned the camera over in my hands. The thick plastic body was freezing cold to the touch. This specific model of digital camera was manufactured and released to the public 10 years after the date, currently glowing on the screen. It was technically impossible for the internal calendar to revert to a year before its own software existed. I pressed the menu button with my freezing thumb. The screen remained locked on the impossible date. I am an urban photographer. My current project involved exploring and documenting the severe architectural decay of abandoned commercial properties. I was standing in the exact center of the main promenade of a massive, ruined shopping mall that had been officially boarded up for over a decade. The large central skylights above me were shattered. Rainwater and heavy snow had freely entered the building for years, causing severe structural rot. The tile floor was covered in a thick layer of wet, black mold, rotting leaves, and the sharp fragments of broken safety glass. The internal environment was incredibly hostile. The ambient temperature inside the massive isolated structure was well below freezing. The stagnant air was thick and smelled heavily of wet drywall, rotting fiberglass insulation, and feral animal waste. My breath formed thick white plumes of vapor in the dark space. The only illumination came from the powerful tactical flashlight mounted to the top rail of my camera rig. The harsh white beam cut through the heavy, dusty air, illuminating the rusted metal security frames of empty storefronts. I applied strict technical logic to the camera malfunction. The freezing temperature was severely degrading the power output of the lithium-ion battery. Extreme cold is known to cause severe voltage drops in complex digital equipment. A sudden loss of continuous voltage can cause the internal memory controller to crash, resulting in corrupted data rendering on the liquid crystal display screen. The timestamp was simply a random string of numbers generated by a failing microchip. It was a completely mundane hardware failure. I pressed the power button, forced the camera to shut down completely, and placed it inside my padded canvas carrying bag. A sudden violent draft of freezing air swept through the vast promenade. The wind howled down the long, empty corridor, carrying a mist of fine ice crystals and abrasive black dust. The ambient temperature dropped significantly in a matter of seconds. The freezing wind cut through my heavy winter coat. I needed to find a smaller, enclosed space to wait out the sudden draft and replace the camera battery in a controlled environment. I shined my flashlight beam across the debris-filled walkway. Tucked into a dark architectural alcove between two ruined clothing stores sat an old, automated photo booth. The large rectangular cabinet was constructed of heavy steel and fake wood laminate paneling. The exterior was heavily covered in spray paint graffiti and peeling promotional stickers. A heavy black velvet curtain hung across the entrance. The thick fabric was stiff with age and accumulated dirt. I walked over to the alcove. My boots crunched loudly against the broken glass. I used my gloved hand to push the heavy black curtain aside. The velvet fabric fell coarse and dusty against my skin. I stepped inside the narrow booth and let the curtain fall closed naturally behind me. The interior space was incredibly small and claustrophobic. It was designed to hold two people sitting very close together. I sat down on the hard plastic bench. The space smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and old, decaying chemical photo developer fluid. The freezing wind from the promenade was entirely blocked. The silence inside the heavy steel box was immediate and profound. I aimed my flashlight directly at the main control panel. The glass screen covering the internal camera lens was heavily cracked. The metal coin return slot was rusted entirely shut. I looked down at the floor of the booth. The thick black power cable had been severed near the base of the machine. The frayed copper wires rested in a small puddle of dried mud. The machine had absolutely no physical power source. I unzipped my canvas bag and reached inside to retrieve a fresh lithium battery. As my fingers brushed against the cold plastic shell of the spare battery, the small enclosed space of the booth was instantly flooded with a blinding white light. The intense flash originated from behind the cracked glass of the booth's internal camera lens. The burst of light was so bright it physically hurt my eyes. It left a dark purple afterimage burned deeply into my retinas. I dropped the spare battery. It hit the hard plastic bench and rolled onto the floor. I sat perfectly still in the darkness. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I tried to aggressively rationalize the event. I told myself it was a residual electrical charge. Large internal capacitors in old flash units can hold a high-voltage electrical charge for years, even after the main power is disconnected. The sudden change in ambient temperature, or perhaps a slight physical vibration from my body sitting on the attached bench, had caused the decaying capacitor to finally discharge its stored energy through the xenon bulb. It was a rare, but scientifically documented, electrical phenomenon. It was a complete, harmless coincidence. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for my normal vision to return. The absolute silence in the booth was broken by a low, mechanical grinding noise. It came from the metal panel located directly below the camera lens. It was the sound of small plastic gears turning and heavy rubber paper rollers engaging. I opened my eyes. I aimed my flashlight directly at the panel. A long vertical strip of glossy photo paper began to slowly push its way out of the horizontal metal dispensing slot. The machine was actively printing. The logic in my mind completely failed. A residual capacitor charge could trigger a brief flash of light, but it could not power a complex mechanical printing motor, advance a heavy roll of paper, and apply chemical ink. The machine was fundamentally dead and disconnected from the electrical grid. I froze in pure terror. I did not move my hands. I did not attempt to stand up. I watched the strip of paper slide smoothly out of the metal slot. It made a soft, continuous sliding sound against the steel plate. The paper stopped moving. The strip hung motionless in the center of the flashlight beam. I slowly reached out with my left hand. My fingers were shaking slightly. I pinched the edge of the glossy paper and pulled it free from the metal slot. The paper felt cold and slightly damp from the chemical developer. I held it up to the light. The strip contained 4 vertical photographs. The images were printed in sharp, high-contrast black and white. I looked closely at the top photograph. It was an image of me, sitting on the plastic bench inside the booth. The expression on my face was one of complete shock. The flash had captured the exact moment I dropped the camera battery. The background directly behind my shoulders was completely black. I looked at the second photograph. I was still sitting on the bench. My eyes were tightly closed. But in this frame, something physical was emerging from the solid black background directly behind my left shoulder. It was a human hand. The hand was massive and elongated, the fingers stretching forward at unnatural, broken angles. The skin appeared deeply necrotic and dark. I looked at the third photograph. The decaying, elongated hand was now resting heavily on top of my left shoulder. The long, dark fingers were curled deeply into the thick fabric of my winter coat. The solid black void behind me seemed to be physically pushing forward, consuming the edges of the frame. I looked at the fourth and final photograph. The image was violently blurred. It depicted my own face, twisted in absolute agony, being rapidly dragged backward by the dark hand, directly into the black curtain. I lowered the strip of damp paper. I sat frozen on the plastic bench. The stale air inside the booth became impossibly cold. The heavy black velvet curtain hanging at the entrance of the booth slowly began to slide along its metal track by itself, sealing the exit completely and trapping me in the dark with the entity that sat directly behind me. A shallow puddle of dirty water on the floor tiles reflected the ceiling, but the ceiling in the reflection was actively covered in thick, rolling fire. I stopped pulling the heavy metal handle of the pallet jack and stared down at the small pool of water near my boots. I looked up at the actual ceiling above my head. It was completely normal. There was no fire, no smoke, and no heat. The white acoustic tiles were stained with old watermarks, and the fluorescent light fixtures were dormant. I looked back down at the puddle. The water was now perfectly still, reflecting only the dark, unlit acoustic tiles directly above it. I blinked my eyes and tightened my grip on the thick rubber handle of the pallet jack. I was a late-night delivery driver for a logistics company. I was tasked with bringing a massive wooden pallet of commercial liquid soap into the rear storage area of a struggling mall. It was an after-hours delivery, meaning I had to navigate the empty service corridors completely alone using a set of master keys provided by the property management. The physical labor was intense. The wooden pallet held 40 heavy corrugated cardboard boxes. The total weight was nearly 2,000 pounds. The manual hydraulic pallet jack was old, and the heavy yellow polyurethane steering wheels were worn down. Moving the massive load required me to lean my entire body weight forward and drag it behind me. The heavy wheels generated a constant deep mechanical friction against the hard ceramic floor tiles. I was walking down a wide, decorative promenade designed to connect the loading docks to the main retail atrium. The architecture of the corridor was highly repetitive. The walls were lined with large square support pillars covered entirely in floor-to-ceiling mirrored panels. The mirrors were meant to make the hallway feel larger, but in the dim emergency lighting, they only created a confusing, endless series of dark reflections. The air in the promenade was severely cold. The mall was heavily cutting operational costs, and the internal heating system was completely disabled in the service wings. My breath formed small clouds of white vapor in front of my face. I leaned forward and continued to drag the heavy pallet down the center of the tiled corridor. My shoulder muscles burned from the sustained physical tension. I focused my vision on the floor directly ahead of my boots, avoiding the disorienting mirrors on either side of me. I needed to reach the heavy steel exit door at the far end of the promenade. As I walked, a sudden physical sensation interrupted my concentration. A single heavy drop of freezing water fell from the dark ceiling and landed directly on the exposed skin at the back of my neck. The water was incredibly cold. It sent a sharp, involuntary shiver down my spine. The drop slid slowly down the center of my back, soaking into the cotton fabric of my uniform shirt. I stopped walking. I let go of the heavy rubber handle. I reached back with my right hand and wiped the cold moisture from my skin. I applied a strict, mundane logic to the event. The mall was a failing, decaying structure. The flat roof of the massive building was notoriously poorly maintained. It had rained heavily during the previous afternoon. I reasoned that rainwater had pooled on the roof, seeped through a compromised tar seal, and traveled along a structural steel I-beam before finally dropping through a gap in the ceiling tiles. I also rationalized a brief visual hallucination of the fire in the puddle. I told myself that my extreme physical exertion, combined with the freezing temperature and poor lighting, had caused a momentary retinal flash. The human eye frequently interprets sudden changes in blood pressure as bursts of light or color. It was a basic biological response to heavy lifting. I wiped my hand on my dark uniform pants and turned my head to look at my own reflection in the nearest mirrored pillar. I stood perfectly still and looked at the glass. The emergency lighting was weak, but I could clearly see my dark uniform and the heavy wooden pallet resting behind me. I raised my left hand to brush a layer of fine dust off the shoulder of my jacket. I performed the physical action. My hand moved from my side, traveled up to my shoulder, and brushed the fabric. The reflection in the mirror did not move at the same time. I watched my own image stand perfectly still with its arms at its sides. Then, exactly 1 full second later, the reflection raised its left hand and brushed its shoulder. My heart rate elevated instantly. The cold air in the corridor felt suddenly oppressive. I stood frozen, staring at the thick glass panel. The logic in my brain frantically tried to assemble a reason for the visual impossibility. I told myself it was an optical illusion created by the sequence of the mirrors reflecting into each other down the length of the hall. The light was bouncing back and forth across the corridor, and my brain was struggling to process the depth of field, causing a perceived delay in motion. I knew light traveled far too fast for the human eye to detect a delay over a distance of 10 feet. But my mind demanded a rational explanation to stave off pure panic. I needed to test the visual data. I slowly raised my right arm and pointed directly at the mirror. I held my arm extended. 1 second passed. Then, the reflection in the glass slowly raised its right arm and pointed back at me. The physical reality of the situation was undeniable. The reflection was not tied to my immediate present. It was lagging behind me. The threat was entirely bound by a specific physical rule. I realized that the image in the glass was copying my actions from the past. A cold, terrifying deduction formed in my mind. If the reflection was delayed by 1 second, it meant the entity inside the glass was constantly standing exactly where I had been 1 second prior. If I were to turn my back to the mirror, the delayed reflection would be standing directly behind me in the visual plane. I decided immediately that I must never turn my back to the glass. I could not allow the lagging reflection to occupy the space behind my line of sight. I slowly reached backward without turning my head. I found the thick rubber handle of the pallet jack. I gripped it tightly. I bent my knees and applied my body weight. I began to drag the massive 2,000-pound pallet backward down the mirrored corridor. The physical strain was immense. Pushing the heavy yellow wheels backward required entirely different muscle groups. The friction against the ceramic tiles was heavy and resistant. I kept my eyes locked forward, watching the mirrored pillars. As I moved slowly backward, I watched my delayed reflection follow me. The image in the glass walked toward me, always 1 step behind, always 1 second late. The journey to the end of the promenade took 10 grueling minutes. My lungs burned for oxygen. The muscles in my legs trembled from the extreme effort of pushing the massive weight in reverse. I did not blink. I stared at the moving reflections in the pillars. I finally felt the heavy steel surface of the exit door against my back. I stopped pushing. The delayed reflection in the glass stopped moving 1 second later, standing perfectly still in the center of the corridor. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a heavy brass master key. I kept my back pressed against the metal door. I kept my eyes focused on the mirrors. I reached behind my back with my right hand, feeling blindly for the metal keyhole. The surface of the door was smooth. I could not locate the mechanical lock by touch alone. The heavy metal mechanism was recessed into the door frame. I tried for a full minute, scraping the brass key against the steel door, but I could not find the cylinder. The freezing air stung my face. I had no choice. I had to see the lock to insert the key. I had to turn away from the mirrors. I took a sharp, deep breath. I gripped the key tightly. I spun my body around quickly, turning my back to the mirrored pillars. I faced the heavy steel door. I found the metal keyhole instantly. I pushed the brass key into the cylinder. Before I could apply rotational pressure to the lock, a freezing, wet hand erupted entirely through the solid metal door from behind me and clamped violently onto the back of my neck. The yellow metal tape measure extended horizontally into the empty, pitch-black retail space for 30 feet without bending or falling to the floor. I watched the thin metal ribbon spool slowly out of the plastic casing in my hand, defying gravity entirely as it floated straight into the darkness. I pressed my thumb down hard on the black rubber locking mechanism. The metal ribbon stopped moving. I stood in the doorway of the abandoned storefront and stared at the suspended measuring tape. I am a commercial architect. The property management group had hired me to perform a comprehensive overnight structural survey of the failing mall. My firm was tasked with drafting the blueprints for a massive interior renovation. I slowly released the rubber lock and allowed the internal spring to retract the metal ribbon. The tape zipped back into the casing rapidly. The physical weight of the tool in my hand felt completely normal. I clipped the measuring tape to my heavy leather belt. I told myself the strange event was merely an optical illusion. The empty store was incredibly dark, and I was holding a small directional flashlight. The lack of ambient light had completely destroyed my depth perception. The metal tape had likely simply rested on an unseen, perfectly level display table left behind by the previous tenant. It was a simple error in visual judgment caused by working in an unfamiliar environment. I held a thick wooden clipboard in my left hand. Attached to the board was a large, densely gridded sheet of drafting paper. I used a mechanical pencil to draw a straight line representing the dimensions of the entryway I had just measured. My job required intense focus and precision. I had been working alone in the massive isolated building for 8 hours. It was 4 in the morning. My eyes were deeply fatigued from constantly shifting focus between the bright beam of my flashlight and the small, intricate lines on the drafting paper. I needed to move to the second floor to measure the main structural load-bearing walls. I walked away from the empty store and navigated the wide, dimly lit concourse toward the central glass elevator. The elevator was a prominent architectural feature of the mall. It was a completely transparent glass box housed inside a heavy steel framework. It was designed to give shoppers a panoramic view of the indoor fountains as they traveled between floors. I stepped into the glass cabin and pressed the metal button for the second floor. The heavy electric motor engaged above me. The elevator began to slowly rise. Through the glass walls, I watched the dark, empty first floor slowly drop away. When the cabin reached the halfway point between the two levels, the electrical motor suddenly lost power. The glass elevator halted abruptly. The sudden stop sent a slight physical jolt through the metal floor pan beneath my boots. The digital floor indicator panel went completely dark. The internal cabin lights shut off. The only light came from the weak emergency fixtures located on the concrete balconies outside the glass. I stood alone in the suspended elevator. I did not panic. I knew the mechanical infrastructure of the building was severely outdated and prone to failure. I assumed a main electrical breaker in the mechanical room had tripped under a sudden voltage spike. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my mobile phone to call the overnight security guard to manually reset the system. As I unlocked the screen, a new, entirely overwhelming sensory detail flooded the small cabin. It was a smell. The ambient air inside the enclosed glass box was suddenly displaced by an incredibly thick, heavy odor. It smelled intensely of ancient, stagnant dust and raw, wet copper. The scent of the copper was so powerful that I could physically taste a sharp metallic flavor on the back of my tongue. It smelled exactly like a handful of dirty metal coins pressed tightly against my face. The odor was suffocating. It caused the blood vessels in my temples to throb painfully. I immediately applied my medical knowledge to the situation. I suffered from occasional, severe migraines. Extreme visual strain, sleep deprivation, and high-stress environments were my primary triggers. A known physiological symptom of an approaching migraine is an olfactory hallucination, medically referred to as phantosmia. The brain incorrectly processes normal sensory input, creating the illusion of strong, usually metallic or putrid smells. I closed my eyes and massaged my temples with my fingertips. I told myself the smell was not real. It was a neurological misfire. The stalled elevator and the resulting surge of anxiety had simply triggered a severe vascular headache. I just needed to remain calm, wait for security to restart the elevator, and let the prodrome phase of the migraine pass. I opened my eyes and looked out through the thick glass wall of the elevator cabin. I had a clear, elevated view of the second-floor concourse directly in front of me. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the empty walkways. I focused my vision on a massive poured concrete load-bearing wall located 50 feet away. The wall was a primary structural anchor for the entire eastern wing. As I watched, the visual geometry of the environment began to fail. The massive concrete wall slowly began to slide to the left. It moved smoothly and silently across the floor tiles. There was no falling debris, no structural cracking, and no physical resistance. A wall weighing hundreds of tons simply glided laterally across the concourse, changing the fundamental layout of the building. Behind the moving wall, a completely new corridor was revealed. The new corridor was narrow, dark, and angled sharply in a direction that defied the exterior blueprints of the structure. I stood frozen in the glass box. I watched a second concrete pillar slide forward, intersecting with the new corridor to form a complex, impossible labyrinth. The threat was a force that actively consumed and reconfigured physical space. The building was actively shifting its own anatomy. I refused to accept the visual data. I engaged a severe avoidance tactic. I looked away from the glass. I aggressively focused my entire field of vision on the wooden clipboard in my hand. I told myself the shifting concrete was a complex visual aura caused by the escalating migraine. Auras frequently cause spatial distortions, blind spots, and the perception of moving geometric shapes. I was simply projecting the neurological distortion onto the stationary architecture. I gripped my mechanical pencil tightly. I stared at the grid paper. I decided to combat the hallucination by forcing my brain to perform complex mathematical logic. I began to rapidly draw the new lines of the shifting walls onto my blueprint. I meticulously measured the angles of the impossible labyrinth on paper, desperate to prove to myself that the changing dimensions could not mathematically exist within the square footage of the property. I kept my head down. I drew line after line. The smell of raw copper grew thicker. The heavy electrical motor above the cabin suddenly engaged. Power returned to the elevator. The digital floor indicator illuminated. The glass box resumed its upward trajectory. I did not look up from my clipboard. I kept drawing the impossible angles. The elevator reached the second floor. The heavy metal doors slowly slid open. I stopped drawing. I lowered the clipboard. I looked out of the elevator cabin. I was not looking at the second floor concourse. The tiled floors, the glass railings, and the empty storefronts were entirely gone. The elevator doors opened directly into a massive, cavernous tunnel constructed of massive, rough-hewn stone blocks. The air pouring into the cabin was freezing and damp. The smell of raw copper was completely replaced by the overwhelming, undeniable stench of old, coagulated blood. From deep within the pitch-black darkness of the stone tunnel, something immense took a slow, heavy, rattling breath. A dead decorative fish floated to the surface of the water, resting on its side, but its exposed eye featured a glowing, perfectly round human iris. I stopped moving my long telescoping cleaning pole and stared down into the shallow water. The dead fish was a large orange and white koi. It bobbed gently in the small ripples created by my physical movements. The glowing eye was pale blue, complete with a distinct pupil and a fibrous iris texture that emitted a weak, unnatural luminescence in the dim light. I held the aluminum pole tightly in my wet hands. I am an independent aquarium maintenance technician. I was contracted to clean and service the massive shallow koi pond located in the exact center of the main mall concourse. It was 3 in the morning. The mall was entirely empty and sealed for the night. The pond was a large architectural oval, measuring roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was lined with dark gray ceramic tiles and filled with exactly 24 inches of treated water. I was standing directly in the center of the pond. I wore heavy, insulated rubber chest waders to stay dry. The thick rubber straps dug deeply into my shoulders. The water was knee-deep and slightly murky with suspended algae. I held a stiff nylon brush attached to the end of my aluminum pole. My job was to manually scrub the thick layer of green biological buildup off the ceramic floor tiles, vacuum the heavy debris, and clean the primary mechanical filtration screens hidden beneath the decorative rocks. The air in the concourse was stale and smelled strongly of heavy chlorine, DMP concrete, and the distinct organic scent of commercial fish food. The only illumination came from the emergency security lights mounted high on the glass atrium ceiling. The weak light cast long, distorted shadows across the surface of the dark water. I slowly walked toward the dead fish. The thick rubber soles of my waders dragged heavily against the slippery ceramic tiles. The water resistance made every physical movement slow and exhausting. I lowered the nylon brush into the water and used the plastic head to gently nudge the dead koi. The fish rolled slightly. The glowing human eye remained fixed, staring blankly upward. I immediately applied a strict biological logic to the visual anomaly. Fish are highly susceptible to severe ocular infections, especially in poorly maintained commercial environments with high chemical loads. I reasoned that a severe bacterial infection had aggressively consumed the natural tissue of the eye, replacing it with a thick, fibrous white fungus. The bioluminescent glow was easily explained by the presence of a specific strain of naturally occurring phosphorescent algae that had bloomed inside the decaying tissue. I had seen similar, though less extreme, biological reactions in saltwater tanks. It was a completely natural, mundane process of decay. I reached into the waterproof pouch on my chest, pulled out a small nylon net, and scooped the heavy, dead fish out of the water. I dropped it into a thick plastic biological waste bag tied to my belt. I resumed scrubbing the floor tiles. I pushed the heavy brush back and forth in long, overlapping lines. The physical labor was intense. My arms ached from the repetitive motion. I focused entirely on the rough texture of the tiles beneath the brush. After 20 minutes of continuous work, a sudden and extreme environmental shift occurred within the enclosed environment. The ambient temperature of the knee-deep water dropped rapidly. It did not cool down gradually. It plummeted from a lukewarm, comfortable temperature to near freezing in a matter of seconds. I felt the aggressive cold penetrate the thick, insulated rubber of my chest waders. The freezing temperature gripped my calves and knees, sending a deep ache directly into my joints. I stopped scrubbing and let the aluminum pole rest against my shoulder. I stood perfectly still in the freezing water. I breathed heavily. Plumes of white vapor formed in the air in front of my face. I tried to apply my technical knowledge of the mechanical filtration system to explain the sudden thermal drop. The pond was regulated by a massive industrial water chiller unit located in the subterranean boiler room. The chiller used high-pressure refrigerant lines and titanium evaporator coils to keep the water at a constant, healthy temperature for the fish. I assumed the primary digital thermostat had suffered a critical electrical short. This would cause the heavy compressor to lock into a continuous running state, rapidly supercooling the shallow volume of water. It was a severe mechanical failure, but it was a common hazard in old, poorly maintained commercial aquariums. I knew I needed to finish scrubbing the floor quickly, and then go down to the basement to manually disconnect the power to the chiller before the remaining fish died from thermal shock. I gripped the aluminum pole and prepared to take a step forward. As I looked down to find my footing in the murky water, I saw a massive, undulating shadow swimming directly beneath the surface. The shadow was incredibly dark and entirely solid. It moved slowly and deliberately across the gray ceramic tiles. It was physically impossible for a creature of that size to exist in the pond. The water was exactly 24 inches deep. The shadow was at least 12 feet long and incredibly wide. It did not have the distinct shape of a fish. It looked like a dense, formless mass of heavy muscle moving silently along the bottom. It glided smoothly over the area I had just scrubbed, completely obscuring the ceramic tiles. The logical rationalization in my brain failed completely. I told myself it was an optical illusion created by the emergency lighting above. Perhaps a massive cloud of loose algae had clumped together and was drifting in the current created by the filtration return jets. But the shape moved with clear, biological intent. It circled my position, maintaining a distance of about 10 feet. The freezing temperature of the water grew even more intense, numbing my toes inside my rubber boots. I knew that any sudden movement would displace the water and create a loud, physical splashing sound. I adopted an immediate avoidance tactic. I froze completely. I locked the joints in my knees and held my breath. I refused to move my arms. I refused to lift my boots. I believed that if I remained perfectly still, the massive shape would register me as a stationary architectural feature, like a concrete pillar, and simply swim past me. The shadow stopped circling. It came to a complete rest on the floor tiles directly in front of my boots. The dark mass was perfectly still beneath the freezing water. I stared at it. I could not see any distinct features, only the deep, unnatural blackness of its form. I waited for 10 minutes. My leg muscles began to tremble violently from the sustained physical tension and the extreme cold. I knew I could not stand in the freezing water much longer without suffering from severe hypothermia. I had to reach the dry edge of the pond. The concrete perimeter was only 5 feet away from my current position. I decided to move. I planned to slide my right foot slowly along the ceramic floor, never lifting the heavy rubber boot out of the water to avoid making any splashing noise. I slowly shifted my body weight to my left leg. I pressed the thick rubber sole of my right boot firmly against the floor tile. I began to slide it forward. My right boot did not hit the next ceramic tile. The hard, solid floor of the shallow pond was completely gone. My foot slid forward into an open, abyssal void. I lost my balance instantly. I pitched forward, throwing my arms out to catch myself. Before my upper body hit the surface of the water, something incredibly cold, heavy, and physically slick wrapped tightly around my right ankle. The grip was massive and entirely unyielding. The entity violently pulled my legs straight down into the freezing, deep water that mathematically could not exist within the physical architecture of the mall floor. The freshly cut brass key turned into smooth, fragile glass the exact moment I pushed it into the narrow opening of the heavy steel deadbolt. I felt the physical texture of the object change against my thumb and index finger. It went from the cold, ridged density of cut metal to something incredibly slick, frictionless, and brittle. I applied a very slight amount of rotational pressure to the head of the key. The object immediately shattered inside the cylinder. It did not bend or strip like cheap metal. It broke with a distinct, crystalline friction of crushed glass. I pulled my hand back. I held the broken head of the key up to the weak light. It was completely transparent, with sharp, jagged edges that caught the faint illumination. I am a commercial locksmith. I was hired by the corporate property managers to drill out and rekey a long row of abandoned retail storefronts, deep inside a dead wing of the mall. It was tedious, solitary work. I was standing inside a very narrow, claustrophobic service vestibule located behind the main retail floor. The walls were constructed of heavy concrete blocks, painted a pale, institutional gray. The floor was bare concrete, covered in a thick layer of industrial dust and dead insects. The only light source was a single, bare utility bulb caged in thick wire, mounted directly above the heavy metal service door. The air in the vestibule was completely stagnant. It smelled of old grease, decaying cardboard, and the metallic scent of brass shavings from my own clothing. The heavy metal door was painted dark brown. It was a standard commercial fire door, secured by a heavy-duty commercial Morris lock. I stared at the piece of broken glass in my hand. I immediately retreated into my technical expertise to explain the impossible physical transformation. I buy my blank keys in massive bulk orders to save money. The blanks are often manufactured using low-grade zinc alloys coated in a thin layer of brass. I reasoned that a massive manufacturing defect had created a hollow, incredibly brittle core inside this specific key blank. The freezing temperature of the unheated service corridor had contracted the cheap metal. When I forced it into the tight lock cylinder, the sheer physical stress caused the alloy to catastrophically fail and snap. The smooth, shiny surface of the broken metal simply reflected the overhead utility light, tricking my fatigued eyes into perceiving it as transparent glass. It was a completely mundane, though highly frustrating, material failure. I threw the broken head of the key onto the concrete floor. I unzipped my heavy canvas tool bag. The heavy fabric made a loud scraping noise in the small space. I reached inside and bypassed my tension wrenches and picking tools. Since the lock was now permanently jammed with the broken debris, I had to physically dismantle the housing to remove the entire cylinder. I grabbed a large, heavy-duty Phillips head screwdriver with a thick rubber handle. I turned back to the dark brown metal door. I located the two primary steel mounting screws situated on the interior faceplate of the lock mechanism. I pressed the metal tip of the screwdriver firmly into the head of the top screw. I applied heavy forward pressure and slowly turned the handle to the left to loosen the threads. The metal screw was old and slightly rusted. It offered heavy physical resistance. As I forced the screw to turn, it made a sharp, high-pitched metallic grinding noise. I stopped turning. The narrow vestibule fell entirely silent. Then, a distinct auditory response echoed from the other side of the heavy metal door. It was the exact sound of a mechanical screw turning. The sound was highly specific. I heard the grinding friction of metal threads moving against a tapped steel hole. The sound lasted for the exact same duration as my own movement. I stood still and listened. I blamed the noise on severe auditory fatigue. I had spent the entire afternoon sitting inside my work van in the parking garage, operating a high-speed metal key grinding machine. The machine generated a deafening, continuous metallic screech. I knew that prolonged exposure to the grinder often caused temporary tinnitus. My brain was simply generating a phantom mechanical noise in the absolute silence of the vestibule, a delayed acoustic echo of my earlier labor. I shook my head, gripped the rubber handle tightly, and applied pressure to the screwdriver again. I turned my screwdriver to the left, completing one full rotation. I heard the screw back out of the housing slightly. I stopped. Immediately, from the other side of the heavy fire door, I heard the precise mechanical grinding noise again. But this time, I recognized the specific acoustic pitch of the friction. When you tighten a screw, the pitch of the metal friction goes up as the tension increases. When you loosen a screw, the pitch goes down. I had just turned my screwdriver to the left to loosen the mechanism. The sound coming from the other side of the door was the high-pitched friction of a screw being turned aggressively to the right. I removed the screwdriver from the faceplate. A cold dread settled heavily in my stomach. The entity on the other side of the door was mimicking my physical actions, but it was applying a strict, inverted rule. Everything I did, it copied in exact reverse. I realized with absolute horror what this meant for the mechanical integrity of the lock. By attempting to dismantle the lock from my side, the unseen force was actively dismantling the external housing from the outside. I needed to observe the mechanism without standing directly in front of the door. I looked around the cramped vestibule. 3 feet to my left was a narrow utility closet. The wooden door featured angled slats for ventilation. I quietly stepped away from the heavy metal fire door. I opened the utility closet and squeezed myself inside. The space was incredibly tight. It smelled strongly of dried bleach and old mop strings. I pressed my face against the wooden slats. I had a clear, obstructed view of the brown metal door and the mortise lock. I stood in the dark closet and watched. The heavy metal door was completely still. Then, the bottom mounting screw on the lock faceplate began to turn entirely on its own. It rotated slowly to the left. I heard the exact corresponding sound of a screw turning to the right from the unseen side of the door. The entity was now completing the process. The bottom screw backed itself entirely out of the threaded hole and fell, hitting the concrete floor with a heavy metallic noise. I held my breath. I watched through the wooden slats as the heavy brass doorknob and the thick metal faceplate separated from the door. The internal springs and tumblers disassembled themselves completely. The heavy brass components cascaded onto the concrete floor, rolling into the corners of the vestibule. The mortise lock was entirely gone, leaving only a perfectly round dark hole drilled through the center of the heavy brown door. The heavy steel fire door slowly swung outward, pulled open by an unseen weight. The space beyond the threshold did not reveal the main retail floor of the mall. It revealed an absolute, impenetrable pitch-black void. The darkness was thick and dense, absorbing the weak light from the vestibule bulb. I pressed my hands against the wall of the closet. From the total blackness of the void, a long physical arm reached slowly into the illuminated vestibule. The arm possessed no flesh, no bone, and no fabric. It was constructed entirely of thousands of grinding, interlocking brass lock tumblers and jagged internal springs, moving blindly through the air to find what had been working on the other side of the door. The heavy wire bar of the wooden rat trap closed rapidly, trapping a severed human-sized finger made entirely of cold pale wax against the wooden base. I stopped walking and aimed the beam of my headlamp down at the floor. The trap was sitting exactly where I had placed it 3 days ago, tucked against the baseboard of the dark theater aisle. I crouched down to examine the object. The fake finger was highly detailed. It featured small wrinkles over the knuckle joints and a slightly yellowed, opaque fingernail. I reached out with my gloved hand and touched it. The wax was freezing cold and dense. It felt heavy beneath the pressure of my thumb. The metal spring mechanism of the trap had bitten deeply into the wax, leaving a sharp indentation. I am a commercial pest control technician. I was hired by the bank managing the foreclosure of the massive mall to clear out a severe rodent infestation in the abandoned megatheater located on the top floor. The theater complex held 20 individual screening rooms. I was currently working inside theater number 14. The physical environment of the room was dark and oppressive. The theater was enormous, designed to hold hundreds of patrons. The floor was built on a steep downward incline, sloping sharply toward the massive blank movie screen at the front. The floor was covered in a heavy, dark red carpet featuring a repeating geometric pattern of gold squares. The carpet was sticky. Decades of spilled soda and melted candy had soaked deeply into the synthetic fibers, creating a permanent adhesive residue that grabbed at the thick rubber soles of my work boots with every step I took. The air inside the large room was stagnant and severely dehydrated. It smelled heavily of old, rancid popcorn oil, stale dust, and the sharp, chemical scent of the rodent poison I carried in a large plastic reservoir on my back. The only light came from the LED headlamp strapped to my hardent. The beam illuminated millions of tiny dust particles suspended in the dead air. Long rows of folding fabric seats stretched out into the darkness on both sides of the central aisle. The seats were covered in faded crimson velvet. Many of the cushions were torn open, exposing yellow foam padding that had been hollowed out by nesting rats. I pulled a thick plastic trash bag from my belt and dropped the wooden trap, along with the wax finger, inside. I tied the plastic bag shut. I applied a strict, mundane logic to the bizarre object. The mall had been officially closed for months, but local teenagers frequently broke into the upper levels to explore the abandoned spaces. They often left behind trash, graffiti, and strange items. I reasoned that a group of kids had stolen a hyper-realistic prop from a nearby Halloween supply store or a theatrical display and dropped it in the dark aisle while running from the security guards. The wooden rat trap was highly sensitive. The vibration of their running feet on the sloped floor, or perhaps the physical impact of the heavy wax prop falling directly onto the trigger plate, was more than enough to engage the heavy metal spring. It was a completely logical sequence of events. It was a prank or an accident. I stood up, adjusted the heavy straps of the chemical reservoir on my shoulders, and retrieved a fresh bait station from my canvas tote bag. I walked further down the sloped aisle, heading toward the front row of seats. I kept my eyes focused on the sticky red carpet, looking for rodent droppings or chew marks along the baseboards. The physical labor of carrying the heavy chemical tank down the steep incline caused my calf muscles to burn. I reached the bottom of the aisle. A small, empty space separated the front row of seats from the massive, dark screen. I placed the black plastic bait station on the floor and pushed it under the first seat. As I stood up, a distinct physical sensation passed through the floor. It was a deep, kinesthetic vibration. I felt the movement through the thick rubber soles of my boots. The vibration traveled up through my legs and settled heavily in my stomach. The floor did not shake violently, but it moved with a steady rhythmic pressure. I stood perfectly still. The vast theater was completely silent. I waited for a few seconds. The heavy vibration occurred again. The physical pressure under my boots felt like a massive rolling weight passing directly beneath the concrete foundation of the sloped floor. I immediately analyzed the physical data and provided a technical rationalization. The multiplex theater was located on the upper levels of the mall, but the entire structure was built on a deep concrete foundation. The mall was located in a densely populated urban center. I knew that the city operated an extensive subterranean public transportation network. I assumed there was an unmapped or forgotten subway tunnel running directly beneath the mall's footprint. The rhythmic vibration was simply the physical displacement of earth and concrete caused by a massive, multi-ton steel train rolling along heavy iron tracks deep underground. The unique sloped architectural design of the theater floor was acting as an acoustic and kinetic amplifier, capturing the deep vibrations and funneling them upward into the empty room. It was a common structural phenomenon in older commercial buildings. The vibration was entirely mechanical and completely harmless. I turned away from the screen and began to walk back up the steep aisle. I aimed my headlamp at the floor to ensure I did not trip on the sticky carpet. I took 10 heavy steps up the incline. The vibration in the floor returned, but the pattern had changed. The movement was no longer a slow, rolling pressure. It was rapid and chaotic. The concrete beneath my boots trembled with a series of quick, sharp impacts. I felt a rapid succession of small tremors traveling across the width of the theater. The specific rhythm of the vibrations perfectly mimicked the erratic, scurrying motion of a rat running rapidly across a hard surface. However, the physical force required to shake the entire sloped concrete floor in that manner was mathematically impossible for a small rodent to generate. The rapid tremors darted from the left side of the room to the right side, passing directly beneath my boots. I stopped walking. I gripped the thick canvas straps of my backpack tightly. I tried to maintain my logical explanation. I told myself the subway train below had simply increased its speed, causing the iron wheels to strike the joints in the tracks at a faster rate. The erratic feeling was just a mechanical irregularity in the suspension of the heavy rail cars. I took a deep breath of the stale, chemical-scented air. I forced myself to continue walking up the aisle. I kept my vision strictly fixed on the small circle of light projected by my headlamp onto the red carpet directly in front of my boots. The rapid, scurrying vibrations suddenly stopped. The theater was completely still for 3 seconds. Then, a new kinetic force struck the building. The floor violently shifted beneath me. The impact was immense and singular. It felt like a massive, heavy column of pure weight had been dropped directly onto the upper balcony of the theater. The physical shock wave traveled down the sloped floor. The long rows of heavy, folding fabric seats on either side of the aisle began to rattle violently against their metal floorbolts. The single impact was followed by another, then another. The rhythmic vibration was now the distinct, undeniably heavy cadence of massive footsteps. Something of unimaginable size and weight was walking slowly across the upper seating area. The seats shook with every massive impact. My survival instinct initiated an immediate avoidance response. I employed a strict almost-look tactic. I refused to lift my head. I refused to shine my light into the upper balcony. I stared intensely at the red and gold carpet directly ahead of my toes. I kept my head angled sharply downward. I reasoned that if I did not visually acknowledge the massive physical anomaly, it would not acknowledge me. I stood perfectly still on the sloped floor, enduring the intense physical tremors shaking my legs. I watched the dust particles dance violently in the beam of my headlamp. The deafening vibrations grew closer. The heavy, rhythmic impacts moved down the sloped aisle, descending from the upper balcony toward my position. The metal frames of the seats closest to me rattled violently. The vibration stopped. The immense physical weight settled directly in front of me, no more than 3 feet away. I did not move. I kept my eyes focused on the floor. Into the small circle of light cast by my headlamp stepped a pair of pale, bare feet. The feet were human in shape, but they were massive, spanning the entire width of the center aisle. The skin was completely hairless and possessed the exact dull, opaque texture of cold wax. I slowly panned my headlamp upward. The light traveled up the massive, pale legs. The limbs stretched vertically upward, rising far past the seating rows, continuing up into the pitch-black void of the high theater ceiling, entirely ignoring the bait station I had left behind. The blue ballpoint pen pressed into the yellow sticky note failed to leave a mark, and the words I had just written slowly dissolved into the paper until the surface was completely blank. I sat back in my heavy office chair and stared at the small square of paper stuck to the edge of my computer monitor. I held the cheap plastic pen in my right hand. I rolled the tip over my thumb. The metal ball bearing was covered in wet blue ink. The pen was fully functional. I looked back at the yellow note. 3 seconds ago, it displayed a short list of numeric employee identification codes. Now, it was a pristine, empty yellow square. I am the general manager of a struggling retail mall. It was late Friday night, hours after the main public doors had been locked. I was sitting at my desk in the main administrative office, finalizing the bi-weekly payroll reports before the weekend. The administrative suite was located deep in the central service corridor, completely isolated from the main retail floors. My personal office was incredibly cramped and cluttered. The space was barely large enough to hold my large faux wood desk and a tall metal filing cabinet. The walls were constructed of basic white drywall, scuffed and marked by years of moving furniture. The ceiling was low, fitted with a single rectangular fluorescent light fixture that emitted a constant, high-pitched electrical hum. The desk was covered in tall stacks of printed spreadsheets, loose receipts, and half-empty ceramic coffee mugs. The air in the small room was stale, warm, and smelled strongly of old paper, burnt coffee, and the sharp ozone scent of the aging desktop computer tower resting near my feet. I applied a firm technical logic to the disappearing ink. Office supply companies frequently manufacture specialty pens filled with thermal-sensitive ink. The ink is designed to become completely transparent when exposed to specific levels of heat, allowing for easy friction erasing. The large cathode ray tube monitor on my desk was an older model that generated a significant amount of ambient heat from its ventilation vents. The yellow sticky note was attached directly to the plastic bezel of the monitor, right next to the exhaust vent. I reasoned that I had accidentally grabbed a thermal ink pen from the supply closet, and the continuous wave of heat radiating from the heavy monitor had simply triggered the chemical reaction, turning the blue ink transparent. It was a frustrating, but entirely mundane, chemical event. I tossed the plastic pen into a desk drawer and rubbed my eyes with the palms of my hands. My eyes were deeply fatigued. I had been staring at the bright spreadsheet on the monitor for 6 continuous hours. I suffered from extreme administrative burnout. The constant stress of managing a failing commercial property, dealing with angry tenants, and balancing shrinking budgets had severely degraded my physical health. I leaned forward to grab a different pen from a ceramic cup. As I shifted my weight, a sudden and intense wave of vertigo washed over me. The physical sensation was highly disorienting. My inner ear felt entirely unbalanced. The small office seemed to tilt slightly to the left. I gripped the edge of the heavy desk to steady myself. The nausea was brief, but powerful. I looked around the room. The visual geometry of the space felt fundamentally wrong. The sharp 90-degree corners, where the white drywall met the ceiling, appeared slightly blurry and undefined. The distance between my desk and the metal filing cabinet seemed smaller than it had been an hour ago. The claustrophobia of the small space intensified dramatically. I immediately rationalized the spatial distortion. I knew that extreme visual fatigue, combined with severe stress and lack of sleep, can cause complex optical illusions. The harsh, unnatural spectrum of the overhead fluorescent light was overstimulating my retinas, causing a loss of depth perception. The blurry corners and the feeling of the room shrinking were classic symptoms of a stress-induced ocular migraine. The brain struggles to process spatial data when the eyes are exhausted. I knew I needed to leave the office immediately. I needed to step outside, breathe fresh air, and look at objects in the far distance to reset my visual focus. I decided to leave the payroll reports unfinished. I stood up from the heavy office chair. I reached over the tall stacks of spreadsheets and grabbed my winter coat from the back of the chair. I turned around to face the back wall of the office, intending to walk out through the heavy wooden door into the main hallway. The door was completely gone. I stood perfectly still, holding my coat in my hands. The space where the heavy wooden door and the metal door frame should have been was entirely replaced by a solid, seamless expanse of white drywall. There was no outline. There were no hinges. There was no doorknob. The white paint was perfectly uniform, matching the rest of the walls exactly. The logic in my brain frantically attempted to assemble a reason for the physical impossibility. I told myself my spatial disorientation was far more severe than I realized. I assumed I had simply turned the wrong way in the small, cramped room. I was facing the wrong wall. I quickly spun my body to the right, looking at the adjacent wall. It was solid white drywall. I spun to the left, looking at the wall behind the metal filing cabinet. It was solid white drywall. I turned back to the original wall. I dropped my winter coat onto the floor. I walked forward and pressed my hands flat against the painted surface. The wall was hard, cold, and undeniably solid. There was no hollow space behind it. A cold, primal panic seized my chest. The threat was a liminal force that physically erased architectural existence. The door had not been hidden. It had been entirely deleted from reality. I began to frantically claw at the white paint where the exit used to be. My fingernails scraped against the hard gypsum board, leaving shallow white grooves. I breathed heavily. The warm, stale air in the room felt incredibly thin. The silence of the enclosed box was broken by a new sound. It came from the exterior window located on the wall directly behind my desk. The window looked out into the pitch-black expanse of the main mall concourse. The sound was soft, wet, and highly continuous. It was the distinct noise of heavy, damp flesh dragging and scratching slowly against the outside of the thick glass pane. I slowly turned around to look at the window. As I turned, my hip bumped painfully against the edge of my desk. I realized the physical dimensions of the room had changed again. The desk was now pressing tightly against my body, forcing me against the drywall. I looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light fixture was now only inches above my head. The room was actively, silently inching inward. The drywall was erasing the square footage of the office, pushing the desk, the filing cabinet, and my body into a rapidly collapsing center, while the wet scratching on the dark glass grew deafeningly loud. Your shift in the mall may be over, but the nightmare doesn't stop here. The algorithm has selected your next descent into liminal terror. Click the video currently on your screen to step directly into the fluorescent hum of the abandoned hospital wing. And let the binge continue.